This is the first in a series of Irish Studies seminars taking place this semester and next, the aim of which is to highlight the range and the quality of Irish Studies related research taking place right the way across the university in multiple disciplines. And through that seminar engagement, hopefully stimulate conversations across disciplinary and school boundaries. I'm going to be saying quite a bit about Dominic later on, so I'm not going to say it now. He really doesn't need any introduction. Dom has been, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the director of the Institute of Irish Studies for quite a few years now, before stepping down to go on to greater things, which he'll be telling you a little bit about in this paper at the end of July. So I'm going to come back, and this is obviously not only the first of our seminar series, but also an opportunity to hear Dom speak about his research, but also to celebrate his leadership of Irish Studies. And we'll be doing that after the paper, with the opportunity to have a drink and a bit of conversation. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dom, who's talking about his recent and research and the impact coming out of that research project. And the title, as you can see on the screen, is Flags, Parades and Carnivals, Approaches to Public Space in Belfast. So, Dom.
Thanks very much. Read it. Actually feels like I've been using the same title for things for about 20 years. That'd be about right, Neil. Have we done anything which hasn't had the word parades in it? Thank you very much, and it's lovely to see such a crowd here. And what I thought I'd take the opportunity today, when Peter suggested that I gave this first paper of the seminar series, was that I would do effectively a little bit of a review of a certain strain of work that has gone on here for about 15 years or so, and in doing so be able to name check quite a few people on the way. In doing so, I'll also be ignoring some people who did lots of work here, but don't exactly fit into the area that I'm interested in. There's a lot of counting of flags and that sort of stuff. So Eamon's here, and Eamon, apart from this beginning name check, Eamon doesn't get someone right next to Eamon is Olwyn, and Olwyn also doesn't get stuff. Olwyn was my first PhD student, and first meeting we had, as some people might know, Olwyn was telling me how much she loved doing stuff on the big house, and I told Olwyn how much I thought probably big houses needed to be burnt down, and we still managed to get through afterwards. And Patrick here is has just finished his PhD on the Irish in Argentina, which I think is going to be fantastic work. And that all three of them are examples of people who have been deeply involved with the Institute, but not perhaps for their sake in counting flags. And there are other people who won't get a name check who probably should do in the rest of the university. I'm going to be talking about public spaces, and I'm going to be talking about an approach to them, and some of the research that was done here, but I'm not going to, for instance, mention our friends, particularly in sociology, who did loads of work on divided cities. And then there's lots of work that's been done by Frank Gaffican as well, Mike Morrissey and Ken up there, who've done similar sorts of work, which deserves to be name checked here in terms of what Queen's has done, but I'm going to go past that as well. And surprise, and also I'll come back because people like Fred Bowl in the geography department here have been important. Pete Sherlow and others. So there's a whole strain of work that links into this that I'm not necessarily going to. I'll probably surprisingly give even Neil Jarman relatively few name checks in this, although people know that I've worked for a long time with Neil. It was of no intent of mine really, when I ended up at the Institute of Irish Studies, to produce something which I think quite quite fitted in with the long history of the Institute of Irish Studies, and that was Eston Evans and a cultural geography, an understanding of place and space. I don't think at the time I saw myself as doing that, but I think in the end that is sort of what we've done, which is quite nice. So the Institute of Irish Studies was founded in 1965 by Eston Evans, and I think in many ways, as I hope to show you, we've lived up to that tradition quite well, although I'm not claiming that I sat down and thought that that's what could be done, but I think by the end of it you'll probably agree that, I hope you'll agree that we have done. All right. Now, if I want to talk, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about an approach to dealing with public space, and I'd like to talk about some of the projects that we've done, and there'll be some lists and also some of the students that have worked off that, in a hope that gives you a body of work that's been undertaken, but also what are some of the policy outcomes and some of the disputes that have come out, and what I think are the key issues. And I'll save right to the end a little ritual experiment that I'd quite like to do with everybody here, in the hope that you'll all feel very uncomfortable by it, but we'll see when we get to that. In a very simple way, as an anthropologist, what has interested me has been what I like to call the symbolic landscape. That's how people narrate meaning of an identity in their physical world. The spaces, the buildings, the symbols, the memories, the memorials, the parades, the protests, the carnivals. The landscape, which is a reflection of power and identity, and that changing landscape, how people are continually using the landscape, and there's so many examples. One's often tempted to say that Northern Ireland is a fantastic example for this sort of stuff, and I suspect it probably is, although of course all spaces and all cities are interesting from this perspective. And I'll go into just a little bit more detail on the various theoretical angles that you can come at with this, and the different disciplines that therefore become engaged by it. But what this approach does is that it allows you to look at the development, or it has allowed us to look at the development of what we might call public space or civic space. Now, there are numerous meanings both for public space and for civic space, and in the main, what's interested a lot of the people involved in this has been a public space that is a real physical space rather than something like the internet. There are obviously a number of ways you could define that space, but we've been interested in the physical space, and in the same way we've been interested in the civic dimension to that physical space, rather than what could easily be a broader definition of that civic space. What's made it so interesting, I think, for me, has been the way that links in to a certain range of democratic principles. So I'm always trying to tell students that perhaps unlike myself, you want to be careful of sucking yourself into Northern Ireland, which can be a bit of an academic black hole, which I'm looking around the room, there's more than one person here who's been through that hole. In the sense that most of them are going to need jobs outside, so you've got to think about what it is that this place is saying about the outside world. And I think, for me, one of the most interesting things has been how this place becomes a case study in trying to create some sort of a democratic space in a highly divided societies. And of most interest around that have been ideas of, for me, have been freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, things like freedom from harassment and hate speech and things like that. And in fact, Neil's provided a fantastic example of what you can do with it, because he then has been all over Europe, and particularly Eastern Europe, with various organisations, looking at how, having learned from this place, looking at how that then replicates it in other places where you've got very different examples, but in Eastern Europe, pride parades in those places and things like that. All right. It also, the same core idea allows you to look at those spaces over time. All right. So and look at how the spaces are being used at particular periods of time by different classes, by different ages, by gender, by ethnicity. It's a sort of model that tells you about a historical space as well as a physical space. And there's a number of people who've worked on that, who've been through the institute, and I can think Roisin Higgins is one obvious example, and has worked with Margaret on a lot of the thinking about the commemorations of 1916, but over periods of time. And I'll come a bit back to that because we've had a project that looked at that as well. And it also links into a whole sphere of study which I find interesting around contestation in the public space. Looking at private spaces versus the commons or the open public spaces, the norms and values of what you can do in those spaces, what we call what in the UK gets called public order, and then violence, threat and harassment. So that almost all of these public events, most of you who know me will guess that I'm getting, every time another American footballer kneels down during the American national anthem, I get excited and I'm going along with that. That's a very typical example of the sort of manipulation of public space and the public arena that I find really interesting. And I'm guessing at the moment, if we come away from public space, if we're looking at something like that, and if people let me know if they're following this, I'm guessing at the moment that in schools right across the United States of America, there are more and more students not standing for the national anthem when they do the Pledge of Allegiance at a school. It's just I don't know that, but given what's happening out there in the arena, I guess that sort of thing's taking place. So the sort of issues you find here, I think, can be replicated and understood in studies more generally around contestation and public space and divisions within society. And above all, I hope what all of this is an understanding of how power works, in how power engages with that public space that always seems to me so interesting. And power is so multifaceted in that it's not only how the powerful at the top, but how, of course, people mobilise at the bottom to create events that might change things. Just to give you an example, you'll be pleased to say I'm not going to go through the history of this. I sometimes like to put up a nice list of public inquiries. I'll read it, Neil. I know you haven't got your glasses, mate. Public inquiries or public reports or changes of policy in Northern Ireland. So a lot of money has been spent here on trying to get the public space issue, the parades issue, all of that. So I'll read it down just so that you get a feel for it. 97, the Independent Review of Parades and Marches. 1999, the NIO Review of Parades legislation. Also 99, the Patten Report Reforming Policing. 2001, the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee looked at it. In 2001, the Guidelines for a Cultural Diversity on Policy. 2002, we had our second inquiry on it, Quigley Review of Public Processions Act. 2004, the Northern Ireland Select Committee sat and reviewed it. 2004, Belfast City Council came up with a new good relations strategy to help around it. 2005, they produced the joint protocol on flags, and also a new report on mediation measures for parades in Northern Ireland, as well as a shared future document which became the then policy for this area. 2007, the Parades Commission produced a new review of themselves. 2008, Paddy Ashdown was brought fresh from Bosnia to produce another review. So that's our third major review in 10 years of the situation. 2008 was also a review of shared future. In 2010, cohesion, sharing and integration. This was a new policy attempting to move the shared future policy on And then in 2011, OFM, DFM came up with new parades legislation talks just for them to be voted down at the Grand Orange Lodge, because I believe a whole lot of Ulster Unionist Orangemen had got into the Grand Lodge, pissed off with the DUP, and because the DUP and Sinn Féin had done a deal, as I understand it, they then voted it down. So Sinn Féin, the DUP, came up with new legislation and it got voted down. Then we had another review of the flags protocol and the cohesion sharing integration process. Then 2013, we got together Building a United Community. That's a new policy on this area. Then we had Richard Haas coming in to do some negotiations. We've had a fresh start agreement. We've had 3 or 4 agreements. And now we've got a Commission on Flags, Identity, Culture and Tradition, which some of you might know I am co-chair. Why is... I mean, it seems stupid just listing it all, but it does remind us exactly the sort of energy, the sort of and public money that's gone in to try and deal with the nature of contested space in just that period of time. And if you went back, in time, you can find these sort of disputes repeating time and time again. There's a long-standing dispute in Craigavon from about 1977 to 1983 over the building of a GAA pitch, where the council kept demanding that you could only have your GAA pitch as long as you agreed to fly a Union flag over it the whole time. That, to believe me, if you go around to local councils, that is very typical of things that are going on almost constantly. So, what sort of interests me is what can us academics offer to it? Now, I'm in a room of people who hopefully will be quite supportive of this idea, but I want to be quite defensive of academia and academics here and say we've got a lot to say about this stuff, all right? And we've got a lot to say about this stuff that's very useful, and that the sort of approaches that I'm going to talk about work, and they work on a policy level. And that having this broader approach, a critical approach to looking at public space, is important. So, if I'm to move on and talk a little bit about the different theoretical strands one can bring to it. All right, I'm not going to go into any of this. You'll be pleased to know in detail. But broadly speaking, the work that's taken place, which I'll talk through, has used a whole series of different types of theory, but that all work quite well together. You've got a whole range of theories on place, power and space. Obviously the French sociologist Lefebvre is a particular obvious example, since that's specifically what he looked at, but there's a whole range of theories around that which are very, very relevant, and I'll come back and explain why in a minute. I'm particularly fond, as people know, of theories of symbol and ritual, and the way ritual and symbols work in that public space, and I'm going to come back with an example of that in a minute. Linked into that are theories of identity, because there's a fundamental and interesting question of how effective these events are. So right the way through the research we've been doing, we've been interested in, do symbols and rituals make a difference? It's a sort of anthropological given that they do. It's a political science given that they do. You know, when people talk about, I don't know, Hitler doing one of his charismatic speeches, or anybody, you look at those events and you sort of take it for granted that these are now in history, they must make a difference. Actually, both in anthropology and social psychology and political science, it's actually quite difficult to work out how much they really do make a difference. How do they make a difference? So linking in with theories of identity, I think, is important. There's been a whole series of work on theories of urban development, which one can look at. Some of which has been done at Queen's. If there's any one person who sort of started all of this off in terms of way of looking at divisions in Northern Ireland, I'd have to name Fred Bowl as probably the key person. I think Fred, in 1968 or 69, went up and down the Shankill counting flags. And he writes it in a report, although in one of his articles I was trying to get from him, he counted flags, and I was trying to get from him whether the flags were on lampposts or whether they were on houses, and Fred couldn't remember whether they were on flags. And I'm saying, it's important now. But anyhow, then there's, playing off this is a whole series of work on theories of remembering and commemoration, which I've been interested in very recently. And for reasons which we won't discuss today, at least not without drink, there's a relationship between that and Irish history and memory, and looking at the decade of centenaries and what role centenaries play, or what role commemoration plays in all this, and the power that commemorative practice gives to symbols. And then the last element of it is conflict transformation. Where do these events play out in creating and bringing conflict on? But there's clearly ways in which the same sorts of rituals, the same sorts of practices play out in bringing people together. All right, rituals can change things in many different ways. I might try my argument later that we really need a new flag for Northern Ireland, but the general idea, the gist is that if you have some sort of change, some sort of political change, you need to symbolise it. South Africa is a fairly good example of that. And so that, as well as understanding these sorts of events as movers of conflict, they also are potentially ways that people are brought together. And I'll come back to that again a little bit later on. So what are some of the key ideas that come out of this before I go on to looking at some of the research here? Well, fundamentally, it's all about, for me, the relationship between public space and power, and the power of certain groups within different societies. And as I'll talk towards the end, I think you can map that over time quite interestingly. At the crux of this research is what I would call a social constructivist approach, that we're constantly involved in processes of creation and recreation. Now, the social scientists and the political scientists will have endless arguments about how strong these identities are, how much they manifest over time, how much they can be changed. That's a debate that we're having all the time, but nearly everybody has agreed that this is being socially constructed in some ways. And much of that is about theorising the social group. And I try very hard these days not to use this word here, community, if I possibly can, because it always seems to me to be it's the C word in Northern Ireland politics, isn't it? It's the one that everybody uses to try and get effect. Whereas what I always try and think that we're talking about is the social group, and what sort of social group are we talking about? So if you're talking about Protestants and Catholics, what sort of social group are they? And just opening up that question with students, I think, is always a useful one. Let's get down to group levels. Let's understand what sort of social group are we talking about. Now, in terms of the formation of those groups, what is interesting is meaning and participation. So the general theoretical background that interests me, for example, with symbols, is how do you create groups using symbols? And this goes to the heart of some of the questions. How important are symbols? Are they just a subpart of being social? Are they not really the issue? People are really thinking about something else, or are symbols actual key in making social groups work? And a number of the theories, people like Benedict Anderson looking at imagined communities, and Anthony Cohen look at the symbolic construction of communities, will argue that actually they're quite crucial. That the flag, that somebody's flag works because people can identify with it. Millions of people can identify with it without necessarily agreeing on their politics. So you get the modern nation or the modern social group, which is extremely diverse and yet still has the same feelings and emotions over a particular flag. So one of the things running all the way through what I'll talk about in the second half is how important really is a symbol. All right, is it at the heart of our politics, or is it a subplot? So you can end up with debates about, when the flag was taken down in Belfast City Council, was that actually about the flag? And there's a reasonable argument to say the flag is what gets people angry. The other shit isn't actually. It is the flag that gets people angry. All right? They don't argue about education. They don't protest about that. Or is it not really the flag? Is it a whole load of other things that people are angry about, which the flag symbolises? And I've got to be honest, after 20 years of this, I'm not sure which of those it is, which is going to disappoint you. But I think but obviously that becomes an important question in trying to work out how you solve some of these problems. And the second bit, as I've said, is participation. Because what we do know is that participating in events, whatever the meaning is important. All right? People get something out of events. It leaves a mark on them, particularly if these events are exciting and emotional. I'm still struggling from the fact that I've never quite found anything as exciting as that 1980s Jam concert that I went to in Guildford Civic Hall. It really was that good, and 100 concerts since and everything just doesn't come close. But the point being that participation is exciting and it's interesting and it makes a difference to people. So, does being in a St Patrick's Day parade in the centre of Belfast change the way people feel about Belfast? Does participating in the centre of the city? So I'll talk in a minute. Does being in an event, once Republicans have now got into the centre of Belfast and they've had their demonstration and they've waved their tricolours and they've stuck them in Queen Victoria and they go away and they can come back the next week and they've really started doing it now, do they then feel differently about the centre of Belfast? All right, does their relationship with that city change? All right, since, shall we say, the 1990s? And if it does that make a significant difference to our politics? All right, does that mean that we're a bit more of a together city, despite the fact that residentially we appear more divided than ever? Okay, I think that's an interesting question. And one argument I make is that this city is both more divided and more shared than at any other point in its history. All right. Then on top of that, the things that have come out of the research we've done over the years, the role of violence, and for me, I can't get over how much you see the impact of violence, an act of violence, roll down over the years. I mean, that's, if ever there's something I would like to get over to people, and I mean, it may sound stupid, is that any act of violence or many acts of violence have repercussions which you can't possibly control going down decades. All right, and I think you can see that around the streets of Belfast, and indeed, I think a good little case study in it, since Neil's here, is the Bogside, and looking at how the Bogside imagines itself, and the impact of those moments in Bloody Sunday and everything that comes down from it. I think is if ever you want to warn any state against use of violence like that, I think take them around the Free Dairy Museum and get them to have a look and think about how much it might cost, not only in lives. How do people view, so we're interested in how people view the world, and therefore we're also interested in the potential for change. And the question comes is, if you start getting all this stuff together, can you do policy? Can you really change things? Now, this is where I'm going to go through a bit of a name check, because I thought it might be worth looking at some of the projects that we've done and some of the researchers that have been here, so you can. So at the very least I can remind you some of the things we're doing without going through it. So let me go through them very quickly, because again, probably I'm breaking all the rules of PowerPointing for the people at the back there, aren't I? You're supposed to have big letters, that sort of thing. In a way, I mean, for me, all of this work started off with the parade stuff that Neil and I did in the 1990s. But as an academic piece of research here at the Institute, myself and Gillian McIntosh, and then along with Gordon Gillespie, had a project from 2002 to 2005 which asked the questions: how would all the symbolic repertoire in Northern Ireland change? Will we get new flags? We were interested in Stormont as a space. I found it fascinating that at the agreement, you could imagine easily that Sinn Féin would go, no, we're not using Stormont. On no account are we using Stormont. That is exactly what we don't want. That's the old regime, that's everything. But of course, as we know, a little bit more interestingly, they did sort of the opposite and said, whoa, we're going to own Stormont. And they all got in the black cabs and they went right up there and pretty much for the next decade pissed the Unionists off royally by... Royally is probably the wrong word. Anyhow, pissed the Unionists off by, in a sense, owning the symbol. It's a very good example. At the same time, you had Molam, bless her. Sorry, Gordon. Where's Gordon Gillespie? Gordon and I disagree on Mo. Trying to reimagine the space with various concerts and things like that, and that was a good example of the sort of contest and the changing spaces that we tried to look at that. And out of that, I won't go through the story now about how Gordon and I started counting a lot of flags, but OFM DFM asked us to look at this problem out of that project, and Gordon and I sat down and started trying to come up with some stuff, and came up with a report that was published in 2005 over both the disputes about flags on public buildings and the stuff on lampposts and street furniture. And it may seem bizarre, but I can't tell you how many times recently when people have talked about the flags problem, and I've heard it, in fact it was mentioned in Stormont just a few days ago. Well, of course there would be no problems with flags on lampposts if it wasn't for what happened when the flag was taken down in 2012. Alright, and talk about a sort of forgetting of history. I don't know what, Gordon, you and I were counting between 2005 and 2010, if it only happened in 2012. It's quite surprising how people even now go back and think about it as if it's a new problem. We've got our own ideas on it, and I'll mention those in a minute. But out of those projects came some other funded projects. Sean Connolly and myself had one which Jill McIntosh was on, John Nagel was on. John published a book on multiculturalism in Belfast out of it, looking at historically how space had worked in Belfast and trying to rethink the city in those sort of ways. And we were able to engage with Belfast City Council on that basis, and out of that also became our St Patrick's Day project, when Belfast City Council asked us if we would evaluate their shared St Patrick's Day, and Cliff Stevenson and Gordon and John Nagel and myself and a whole gaggle of researchers went down and evaluated it and tried to do surveys, and poor old Cliff Stevenson, who's been at Queen's twice since then, tried to get a bit more rigour, scientific rigour into what Gordon and I were doing, and he was a good help on that as well. And then beyond that, we've had another ESRC project that looked at participation in ritual events. Steve Reicher was involved in that as well, and a whole series of people. And then we've had projects looking at Armagh particularly. We've since had money which looked at from the Irish government looking at the Belfast flags dispute. And Paul Nolan and myself have had another look at flags, and at the moment there's a project that Marie Coleman and I have got on the Decades of Centenary, and another big ESRC project called the Belfast Mobility Project, which Neil and I again are working on along with John Dixon. And now we've actually come to the point, having done all this, where yes, we are digitally tagging people and following what they do as they go around. They can now download, it's all ethically sorted, they download a program onto their phone which they can take off, and all of that sort of stuff. We experimented on Neil for a whole weekend by tagging him, and discovered that he does have actually as dull a life as you might expect. So what are the sort of policy outcomes we've had from that? Well, there are all sorts of there are all sorts of things. They're probably the four major flags reports we've had over that period of time, and we've tried to look at various points at how things are changing and why they're changing. As I said, it's interesting that just recently people have put it to me that this is all to do with the Belfast flag and the City Hall fair, whereas doing some back research, I think Gordon and I would argue that probably the key moment is interestingly internal to the Loyalist community, that actually it was the dispute between the UVF and the UDA that seemed to create a new period of marking space and territory, and I'll come back to that before I finish as well, in 2000 and 2001. But another insight that we got from this, and this one was definitely Gordon coming in one morning and pointing it out, and it seems obvious now, but it is, I think, an important insight. It's one of the reasons you've got the development of all of these flags on lampposts which are left there, is because they are cheap. They're all, it's a bit of modernity. They're all now printed for £2 or £3 in Taiwan. A lot of them have still got the Taiwan labels on when they're put up there. So not only when they're left there hanging do they appear to have less symbolic value, they literally have no value. In other words, whereas in the past you'd have put up a flag on your house or something, you're taking it down because you were going to use it in following years because it was expensive, now you literally can't use those flags for anything when you've taken them down. All right, and that, I think, some of the stuff like that, I think, has been a particularly... Now, how you work on that, I'm not quite sure. But those sort of insights from talking to people, I think, became very important. Now, I'm quickly going to run through another couple of lists. All right, they were the fellows that we've had over the last 12 years. And this is where I must confess, these are the ones that have probably directly worked on the areas that I'm talking about now. Una Frawley produced, amongst all of her talented productions, she's also she also writes fiction as well. But Una has Una's produced 3 books on commemoration. Jill McIntosh, many of you will know, has produced lots of material on this sort of area. John Nagel, Cliff Stevenson is doing interesting things looking at citizenship and participation. Chris Brown was here looking at museums and spaces. Roisin Higgins, 1916. Katie's at the back was here and has worked on a number of aspects of the peace process, but also ended up getting dragged in to do flag stuff with us. And Simon Prince working on the civil rights, and there's a number of others who I could mention. But one thing that I think is really, I know, it's worth it. Bear with me. This will be the one time I know that this list goes up. But this is the PhD students we've had, basically based here. And if I do a very quick read down, it will give you a sense. Liam Kelly, Identity, Space, Civil Rights Movement. Catherine Colgan, Traditional Music and Shared Identities. Betta Vigiani, Commemorative Practice in Belfast. Ros Goldie, Case Studies in Promoting Good Relations. Francis Harkin, The Irish Diaspora and the GAA in London. And Mary Catherine Rawlings, The Politics and Policy of Negotiating Shared Spaces. Bree Hocking, Public Art and Urban Space in a New Northern Ireland. Elena Bergier, Construction Agenda in Nationalist West Belfast. Jackie Witherow, Marching Bands and Peace Building. Let me just stop there. Jackie's a really great example. Jackie went off one summer and counted every fucking band in Ireland, in the north of Ireland. All right, she went off and she thought, I've got to know how big all this is. So she went round to all the bandsmen, all the band parades, and she counted every flute band. She counted every accordion band. She had the pipe bands. She had the lot, and she had a huge map, and she mapped them all out right across. She was able to show that the accordion bands had disappeared in Belfast, that some of you will know Mid-Ulster is where you tend to find accordion bands, all that sort of thing. All right, and a couple of times more than a couple of times, various meetings, I've been accused of people saying, you know, what are you academics ever doing for us? Well, those figures that Jackie got, I think it was in 2006, have been used by the bands associations, by Nelson McCausland when producing a whole report on bands to show the finance. Those original figures they have used time and time again to calculate the economic worth of the bands area for Northern Ireland. All right, so and it's interesting that Jackie, who worked a whole bloody hard summer doing it, it was a miraculous the amount of work she did. All right, so disappeared off all of those, and every time I see those figures, I always think, yeah, I remember the young academic working hard to get those sort of figures. Jamie Rowlands working on Republican bands, Sarah Templer, Victims and Survivors, Therese Cullen did an ethnography of St Patrick's Day in Downpatrick, Christina Carnivals on the Savile Inquiry and the Consequences, Nancy Anderson reimagining murals, Sean Reming Museums and the Troubles, Cathal McManus Language and Identity, Karen Kettner on bonfires, and we've got Jonathan Evershed doing the Decade Centenaries, Erin Hinson on UBF art production in the Maze, Stephen Miller doing stuff on music and resistance, Irish republicanism, all got their PhDs in within the last 3 weeks. And Pavel, who works on, who will be getting his in this year, working on interface culture. So we've had a whole group of PhD students producing. We've had at least 2 books out of that, and I think there's going to be 2 more coming fairly shortly. And that was Elizabetha's work on memorials and Bree's work on public art in Belfast. Some of Betta's stuff, I can promise you this, that the book that Betta did is great, but not as great as half the stuff that could never make it into the book. And one of the things you have to do when you're doing all this stuff, when you're listening to all this information, listening to the stories, is some of the stuff you sort of know you can't publish for lots of obvious reasons that people understand, and you've got to let it settle in your brain because it tells you something about this space without you ever being able to use it. And Betta created got some amazing material together. So let me finish, all right, by talking a little bit about the way I think things have changed and moved on and the potential around it. So we've now got, I think this is our 3rd version of what you would call since the agreement of a community relations policy. Shared Future was probably, in honesty, put together by the people there may be people in this room who did it. I certainly put some sentences into it. And was used by the British government, but of course Sinn Féin and DUP didn't manage that to agree on it, and partly because people like us, I think, produced it, sort of fair enough. Then there was a 2nd version of trying to put it together, and this was the 3rd version, Together Building a United Community Without Policy. It's not as, like a lot of policies, it's not as exciting. It doesn't seem exciting when you read it, but actually it holds up a lot of things which, even if they achieve that, you think, shit, that'd be good. You know, even if that policy made it. There's a few things over the years which I've never understood at the time, and I now look back on it, and if there's one piece of legislation which I think has changed this place beyond all others, it's Section 75 of the 1998 Northern Ireland Act. And I would say to anybody, most of us at the time would have looked at it and say, how's that gonna, what difference is that gonna make? The amount of meetings I go to, the amount of discussions on funding, the amount of everything where the civil servant or the politicians is sitting there and knows that it has to be compliant with Section 75. Section 75 compliance is written all the way through almost everything anybody does here now. And I think it's a very interesting example of the impact of these things. So this new idea, this building a united community, you can imagine that the fact that that word is used doesn't necessarily, but how you would sell it without that word is another question. All right. So although I hate the word, it is the one that everybody uses. And what are the key issues for me that come out of it that we can have something to say about before we finish? Well, all of that theory has left me to be constantly interested in access and experience of public space in a divided society. And I've divided those into 2 sorts, which I think have impact. One is freedom of assembly, and the other is development of a civic identity through public events. So the first one is We're interested in how that space is changed just by allowing all the groups in. So how does the fact that Republicans now get to use the space make a difference? Some people would say, well, it's not shared space. Just because the Republicans come in one day, the Orange Order come in another day, somebody came... And that feels like, well, that's not shared space. But in its own way, it is shared space. You know, societies, all societies are divided, all right? And if you are giving resource to people to use that space, then it's sort of shared space. And I suspect it has made a political difference. All right. The second, however, is when you start to fund a civic identity, a city identity, or alternative sorts of identity. That's a more proactive way of dealing with public space when the council or the government are trying to define how the space is being used to have some sort of community relations outcome. So, for instance, St. Patrick's Day would be a good example of that, but there are legions of examples to look at. The relationship between public space and democratic participation, the sense of citizenship and identity and belonging, I think is so interesting. All right, how does participation make the difference to you feeling as a citizen? And I think there's quite a reasonable amount of evidence to say that this society is better for allowing wider access. All right, for a sense of belonging, and I think again. Although we've got a bit of time before we get all of the evidence from Derry as the city of culture and things like that, and there's a lot of reasons for there being a problem with those sorts of approaches, I also suspect it makes a difference. I'll move on because I know it's warm in here. And then becomes your problem, all right? All of this sort of stuff, there's lots of things, the policy ways you can buy into. How do you engage with the spaces of territory? And this is the difficult bit. This is the one that sort of weighs upon us in this new commission. Again, listening to the speeches in Stormont on Friday, you had people saying, well, you just got to remember that this is about our tradition and about our past and what we've always done, and we've always been in, you know, we've always put flags up and people should be able to put flags up and all of that sort of thing. All right, but the trouble is, of course, that isn't really what's going on. All right, what you've probably got in a lot of cases is gangs of men, young men, but gangs of men demarcating space over large periods of time. All right, so there's a gap between the idea of having a celebration or commemoration and what we see taking place over the months in Northern Ireland, and that's a difficult thing. So you then into lots of things, the use of violence, paramilitarism, all of these issues, which are tricky because you're often engaging with working class areas where people don't have many resources. All right, and that's what makes this very, very difficult. Issues around the limitation of freedom of speech, when should or shouldn't, in a divided society, and the example of the band going past the church on St Patrick's, the St Patrick's Church in North Belfast on the 12th and playing the famine song is a pretty good example of it, and whether you should regulate that, whether you should stop that. Are people offended if there's nobody listening? All right, there's nobody in the church. All right, where do you come up? How do you decide if people are offended? If somebody hadn't taken a video of it, because I've watched bands do that many a time. That wasn't the first time by a long chalk. I hadn't seen it necessarily in front of that church, but I bet they've done it many times, all right? So can you offend somebody when nobody's there to be offended? You know, we've got all of those sort of things. There's been lots of... Stephen Miller's doing great stuff on rebel bands at the moment. And then if you know, I mean, it's easy for us to look at a lot of these loyalist bands and look at the lyrics. Take a few rebel songs and have a read. All right, take a few of those songs and have a read. Now, if you're doing it up in a pub in West Belfast, all right, that's one thing. As recently happened, if you're doing it in a big publicly funded festival in Ardoyne, all right, and you do the same stuff you would normally do in the pub, all right, you're going to find yourself coming under some sort of pressure. All right, so where are the limitations that we want to to set. And then I suppose the last bit is the production of alternative identities. What space do you give to alternative identities? As people know, I'm a bit of a fan of, you've got to do it, you've got to go there, you've got to engage, you've got to come up with a new flag. We didn't symbolise the peace agreement enough. We didn't work hard enough on making it something that would look great and people could be proud of. Maybe that was impossible at the time, but I still think that was a missed opportunity. All right, and then last of all, it's how different state actors get engaged, how they get involved with these sorts of issues. In constant discussions with the police about whether it's their job to take flags down or not. Should the courts be doing it? Should you make things illegal or not? If you make things illegal, you're taking people through judicial processes. Do you want to take people through judicial processes for putting a flag up a lamppost? Is that really the direction you want to go in? If you don't go in that direction and you just want to persuade them to take it down, will anything change? All right, you start with that territory marking. So that's really my thoughts of the work we've done in recent years. I've tried, some people have seen me try and do this before, I've tried to map out 50 years of Northern Ireland and looking at the changes in the civic space over a period of time. And trying to think about how that space is changing. And I think, and this is obviously, us anthropologists have to try and look scientific sometimes as a Venn diagram. It's a notional idea of where Belfast was in the 1960s. Lord Mayor's shows, royal visits. Lord Mayor's show used to have 100 floats in it. It used to be sponsored to the hilt, all of the farming companies and everything. It used to be a totally different event to that, which is now. There's some beautiful clips that I could show you, but I won't right now. Royal visits, all of that stuff that became part of our civic culture. Leaving out, of course, 1916, tricolours, those sort of things, but also often leaving out things like bonfires, which were problematic, and you go through and they're often being complained about by the council and that, we don't need that. So, there's unionist and loyalist working class stuff, which falls out, even in the 1960s, falls outside the sort of civic sphere. And then in the 1970s, that collapse of civic, the Lord Mayor's show went down to about 35 floats. They were desperate. It almost died completely. Nobody wanted to go and advertise their wares in the centre of Belfast. And things like the 12th went from being part of civic production, in my view, into being outside the civic. And even now, I think the 12th of July. If I was to say it actually oddly, who would have predicted the 12th of July is outside the civic and St Patrick's Day in Belfast is now inside the civic? All right, if you'd have predicted that to Orangemen 30 years ago, they'd have gone nuts. But that's really where we are now. The council, Belfast City Council, pays for a St Patrick's Day. It doesn't really pay for the 12th of July directly. In that 1970s, of course, nationalism is adding to its repertoire with internment events and all sorts of things. I could talk at length about peace groups and things like that. All right, until we get to, in 2007, I was looking at it and imagining the things that we've had then. And what we see since the peace process, I think, and people can say if they think I'm not getting this right, but I think we've seen a growth in civic culture in Belfast. In fact, it's difficult to come across a flipping week when there isn't some festival or other that we all need to be going on. We've become a flipping city of festivals, which is quite a nice thing, really. My favourite happens to be Culture Night, although I was a little bit disturbed by did anybody see the wrestling at Culture Night? There was a woman being beaten up for about 10 minutes in front of my children in the Rinla Writers' Square. And part of me was saying, Dominic, culture comes in all forms, you've got to just let it happen. And the other half of me was saying, this shouldn't be happening! But anyhow, with all of those things, there's St Patrick's Days in it, and the Irish, now if we have an Irish Dance World Championships, all of the Irish dance posters go up. Belfast is comfortable with all of that sort of stuff now. And the West Belfast Festival and all of that sort of thing, Giro d'Italia, all of those sort of things. Pride is, the Pride event's bigger. People sponsor the Pride event. The Pride event doesn't really cost the state any money at all, because companies spend a lot of money on the Pride event, whereas St Patrick's Day and the 12th of July attract no money whatsoever, as far as I can see. When we did our St Patrick's Day research, people were saying, well, it's an economically boom. And when we actually did the footfalls in the shops, it's not an economic boom. In fact, less people go to the shops, less people go to the shops on the 12th. That doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, by the way. I think freedom of speech, I think sod Marks and Spencer's. To be honest with you, why do they own who should do things? And so I'm not advocating an economic model. I'm just saying that some of the claims that are made about what these things do don't add up. All right, and you've got a much more diverse thing, but you've also got problems like official union flags becoming a problem. So that seems to me to be a model of the change that has taken place. And I'm going to finish with this. I've got my little event for you now. So I think significant changes have taken place in the public space, and I'm proud that the Institute of Irish Studies has done somewhat of a mapping job on that, along with our friends that I mentioned earlier in other departments. Over the years, I'm always intrigued by the ongoing importance of symbolic politics, and you cannot open a newspaper. I swear you cannot open the Irish News, the Belfast Telegraph, or the newsletter any single day throughout the year without finding an argument about a flag or a symbol or a parade or something like that. In one of those three newspapers, there's not a day in the year when there isn't an article about it. All right, so it plays this role in our lives here. Is it peripheral? Is it really because we're arguing about other things? Or is it actually how people understand their politics? Is it in a way, is it more important than that? And anybody watching the videos of the after the parade went up on Saturday, of the anger etched on the faces of some of the GARC protesters, at the symbolic nature of having a Catholic priest who seemed to have helped do the deal with the Orange Order, understands that the symbolic, these things appear to be very important. People, and you get arguments about, well, we couldn't get to our shops for 20 minutes. But is it? But obviously, it's not about not getting to your shops. So my question, one of my questions always is, how does this symbolic stuff fit in? Is it actually what the conflicts are often about, or is it a subset of something else going on? And I'm also become increasingly interested in how people use symbols to make people uncomfortable, so that you in a way, the flags on the lampposts are working for loyalists because they know it makes other people uncomfortable. It's not in the right place, all right? It's not on a proper flagpole. It's doing a difficult job. It's doing a different job, all right, for them. And they also know that people can't take it down, all right? And there's lots of occasions where you see what I call enforced rituals. Now, this is where I'm gonna give you an example of something that will probably make you feel uncomfortable. All right. There you go. Thank you, Pavel. Right.
Balance. That's what leadership is.
I'm going to let the first one finish, although I've recently gone through the lyrics of the second and third verse. It's quite bizarre stuff, but... in the time at the Institute of Irish Studies. Right. Okay. Precisely, it's uncomfortable. It's been uncomfortable at this university. All right. I'm very interested in rituals where where you go for one purpose and you're made to feel something for another. I have to put up with it every year with the BRA prize giving that my kids go to. And I'm very interested by how many BRA students are now sitting down when that happens, and BRA have got that problem cooking, all right, which they will probably have to confront, though that's Belfast Royal Academy. When symbols, when the public space is disrupted, when people can use those symbols, put them in another place, and it's powerful and it's difficult, and that was my thinking, is playing the national anthem when you don't expect it, or when you're all seated or you're standing, you know, is an interesting example. And I think in Northern Ireland we have lots of examples of ordinary people playing about with that sort of stuff all the time, pushing you into things, all right, because they know it is so contested. So we do think looking at the struggle over rituals, shifting meanings, is fantastically interesting, and it's been really great, interesting to watch all the commemorative practices, and to finish off and having, and I've enjoyed the last 2 years particularly working with, you know, Marie and Fergal and Peter and Margaret and all the commemorative stuff. We've done a sort of bandwagon over that. None of the bandwagon's been quite as good as Fergal, who's done the top 1916 bandwagon of anybody I know. But Fergal's time's done now. No. 1916's gone. It's gone. We were thinking if we got him a T-shirt of all of the things he's done this year, it would be down at his ankles with the list of dates on the back. All right, but it's been really interesting thinking about what it is about commemoration, which is about the past, and what is it about the present. And Margaret's written a lot on this, and it's been really fascinating to go through that. All right, and in the end, what is the potential for change? And I suppose that's one of the things that I've got to have to think about as co-chair of this new commission. It would have been easy if when they wrote the document it just said this is the Commission on Flags. I'm not saying the solution is easy, but I'd known exactly what I was doing. All right, but they did have to add it's flags, culture, identity and tradition. So it's flags and everything else. But my way of trying to think through it is to think, is there ways that we can talk about the public space and that public arena and how people behave in it? Is there ways we can start to learn about it that we might be able to talk about if you're in a divided society? This is the things that you need to at least be aware of and have to think about in terms of managing it. And also are the ways that all of those other identities that we have, all of those potential identities that exist there, are the ways that they can be underpinned, that doesn't dismiss the division that we know we have in our society and are bound to have sometime in the future, but allow us a safety net that means that the society can work despite its divisions. Thank you.